Okay, think about the last time you felt just incredibly guilty or stressed out over making a bad choice. Now, what if sin isn't actually a matter of moral wickedness, but rather a fundamental misconception about our own independent agency? I mean, what if the original error of humanity was simply the fierce belief that you possess absolute free will?
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on our intellectual detective hats. We're going to bridge ancient philosophy, linguistics, and global theology to uncover a mind-expanding truth about consciousness that spans across centuries and cultures. We are dismantling the illusion of the doer and uncovering a mystical blueprint shared all over the world.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're looking at the misconception of free will, the universal mystical blueprint, the illusion of the doer, the mechanics of surrender, and finally, a massive plot twist with the evolutionary scaffolding. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The misconception of free will.
So let's start by looking at the exact origin of a word we usually associate with deep moral failure and personal guilt. The primary Greek word translated as sin in the New Testament is hamartia. And get this, it's actually an archery term. It literally translates to missing the mark. In classical Greek, it didn't originally mean you were some inherently wicked person. It just meant you made a cognitive error in perception. It's like aiming at the completely wrong target because your ego mistakenly thinks it's the one steering the ship. The crucial takeaway here is that sin originally points to a fundamental cognitive error.
And look at how radical this is when we look at Scripture. Jesus completely empties himself of personal authorship here, stating that the Son can do nothing by himself. He's acting as a transparent conduit, not some autonomous ego flexing its isolated free will. If that awakened state is characterized by literally zero independent volition, well, then what we call free will is exactly the illusion that a separate ego exists to make choices apart from the whole. Believing you're this isolated author of your actions, that's not just a simple mistake, that is the ultimate missing of the mark.
Section 2. The universal mystical blueprint. Now, what's really wild is how this exact same mechanical realization pops up across drastically different cultures. Take the Tao Te Ching, for example. On one hand, you've got the ordinately person, frantic, full of friction, desperately trying to force and micromanage reality. And then you have the master. By embracing the concept of wu wei, or non-action, the master totally relinquishes that delusion of personal authorship. By just stepping out of the way, individual resistance drops to zero, and the seamless universal flow just takes over. The master does nothing, but leaves absolutely nothing undone. When we lay these diverse traditions side by side, it is literally like watching completely different scientists independently discover the exact same law of physics. Just look at the structural alignment. In Sufism, the false self, the nafs, is wiped out in a state called Fana. In the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, the illusion of being a separate something, yesh, is nullified in Bitul hayesh. And over in Hinduism's Advaita Vedanta, the false claim of being the doer, kartritva, has to be dropped to achieve liberation. Across centuries, across completely different languages, the core secret is absolutely identical, letting go of the illusion that you are the one driving the car. Section 3. The illusion of the doer. So, if the doer is just a mirage, how did history's greatest thinkers actually articulate this? Well, the 14th century Christian mystic Meister Eckhart pushes this idea to the absolute limit. He argues that possessing a proud will, a voice that says, I chose this or I did that, actually separates you entirely from the divine ground. To be a true, transparent vessel, your individual will has to be completely extinguished, so that only the greater universal will operates. True spiritual poverty, in his eyes, is dropping every ounce of psychological attachment to being a separate, self-directed author. We see something incredibly similar in Advaita Vedanta through the concept of Maya, or illusion. Advaita reveals that the ego is really just a psychological phantom. It's this localized little knot of consciousness that falsely wraps itself around universal functions, things like breathing, thinking, acting, and proudly claims them as mine. It's basically a character in a dream who falsely believes they're the one steering the dream. The second you wake up, you realize that separate ego never actually had an ounce of independent agency. Bringing this right back to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul perfectly echoes this collapse of independent choice. In Galatians 2:20, he declares that the separate ego, the I, has been completely executed or crucified. He doesn't say he suddenly started making better choices. He says the psychological entity known as I literally no longer lives. It's entirely replaced, animated by a larger divine current. The whole premise of independent, isolated free will, it just totally collapses. Section 4. The mechanics of surrender. Okay,
This brings us to a really practical question. If the separate ego is a delusion, how do spiritual practices actually engineer the intellect into giving it up? Look at the psychological tactics of Zen Buddhism. Zen uses koans, these deliberately unsolvable puzzles, like what is the sound of one hand clapping, to drive the intellectual mind into total intellectual gridlock. The intellect strains, it tries using its free will to crack the puzzle, and it completely spectacularly fails. This is a deliberate war of attrition. It's supposed to be incredibly frustrating. The struggling ego is forced to collapse from sheer exhaustion, and in that exact moment of absolute defeat and helplessness, the artificial barrier drops and reality floods in. Now, while Zen uses exhaustion, core Buddhist philosophy takes a really radical shortcut here through the concept of anatta, or no self. Instead of just telling you to surrender your will, it proves that the doer never existed in the first place. It shows that what we call the self is just a stream of shifting sensations. There is no permanent ghost inside the machine pulling the levers. And because there is no fixed, independent entity to begin with, the concept of a private, isolated free will vanishes completely. It exposes the ultimate cognitive error, the belief that you are an independent actor. This intense surrender of personal agency is so beautifully captured in the biblical account of Gethsemane. Here, the raw human survival instinct, that separate ego desperately desiring self-preservation, explicitly confronts the total erasure of separate volition. The ultimate breakthrough of the awakened state is that complete surrender of personal agency to the cosmic whole. Not my will, but yours be done.
Section 5. The evolutionary scaffolding.
So, how does this all fit into the grand story of humanity? Well, what if the fall of man, eating from the tree of knowledge, wasn't some massive moral catastrophe or a cosmic crime at all? From a neurobiological standpoint, it might have actually been an evolutionary necessity. Think about it. To develop complex problem solving, long-term planning, and moral agency, early humans literally had to draw a sharp line between self and other. The birth of the ego, complete with its powerful operating illusion of free will, was the biological necessity of constructing a psychological I function.
We can actually map this development out across 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is pre-egoic. This is a state of unconscious unity, much like primitive hominids, where there's just no self-awareness. Then comes phase 2, the egoic phase, or the fall. This is the birth of the separate self and that fierce belief in independent free will. It was a necessary, albeit painful, alienation from the whole. And finally, phase 3, the mystical awakening. This is where the temporary illusion of the doer finally drops away, and we realize our deep connection to the totality of reality.
So you can think of the belief in free will as scaffolding. Now, scaffolding is absolutely essential to construct a building, right? Without it, complex human consciousness could never have developed. That fierce belief in independent free will was the developmental scaffolding we needed to mature as a species. But if you, in your own life right now, leave that scaffolding up forever, you remain trapped inside a temporary framework. To truly awaken, that illusion of the separate, isolated ego has to be dropped so the true structure can finally stand clear.
We have traveled everywhere from ancient Greek archery to human evolutionary biology in this explainer, and it all points to one monumental shift in perception. So I am going to leave you with this final, perspective-shattering question to chew on. Are you really an isolated ego frantically driving the car of your life? Or are you, in fact, the entire universe, finally waking up to experience the ride?